Tom Scoops Papa's Newspaper, Part B. Tom's great brain must have been working in his sleep because he was smiling when we got up the next morning. I didn't find out the reason for the smiles until we'd finished breakfast and Papa was having his second cup of coffee. "Why have you kept that old Ramage press in that crate in the rear of the Advocate office all these years?" Tom asked. "Sentimental reasons, I guess," Papa answered. "I published my first newspaper in Utah on that press, the Servalode Advocate, when Servalode was a booming mining town." "Can I have it?" Tom asked eagerly. "What in the world would you do with it?" Papa asked. "J.D. and I can clean out a corner in the barn," Tom said quickly. "We could practice being newspapermen." Papa appeared to be thinking about it for a moment. "The press is just lying there," he finally said, "and the type that goes with it is in the crate. I couldn't use the type when I bought the Washington press, which uses a larger type." Mama helped Papa make up his mind. "Let the boys have it," she said. "Why not?" Swin said. "Then the little grade school kids can play at being journalists." Tom glared at my oldest brother. "I'll make you eat those words someday," he said. "No quarreling," Mama said. Papa smiled. "All right, T.D., he said. You can have the Ramage press." We moved the Ramage press to the barn that afternoon. Then Papa showed Tom how to set type in what he called the make-ready. I didn't know why Papa was bothering because Tom had watched him set type many times and probably could have done it blindfolded with his great brain. Then Papa oiled the press and put the make-ready in the bed of the press. He put a card on it and turned the wheel of the press. Then he lifted out the calling card and handed it to Tom. I peeked over my brother's shoulder and read T.D. Fitzgerald. "There you are, T.D., Papa said. You can start learning to be a journalist by printing calling cards for all your friends." The next morning, after Tom and I had done our chores, he told me to get my wagon and follow him. We went to the rear of the ZCMI store. Tom went inside and asked Mr. Harmon if he could have one of his big wooden packing crates. Mr. Harmon came to the rear loading platform of the store. He told us we could take any wooden crates except the one a dog called Old Butch used for a home. Tom and I loaded the big wooden box on my wagon. When we got to the barn, he sent me to the tool shed for a hammer. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Make a desk," he answered. He finished making himself a desk by noon. After lunch, I followed Tom to the barn, where he practiced setting type until the kids came by for us to go swimming. Tom said he didn't feel like going. It was a hot afternoon, and just right for swimming, so I went along. Tom didn't go swimming with us for the next 2 days, staying in the barn working with his press. Then I figured he got tired of being a journalist because he joined us swimming and playing until we'd finished delivering the new weekly Advocate the following Tuesday. "Take my bike," he said as we returned home, "and go tell Basil, Sammy, Danny, Seth, and Jimmy Peterson to meet me in our barn right after lunch." "What's up?" I asked. "You'll find out this afternoon," Tom said mysteriously. I was curious, especially when Tom locked the door from the inside and wouldn't let any of us in until I told him everybody was there. Then he unlocked the door from the inside but told me not to let anybody in until he called to me. "All right, J.D., I heard him shout a moment later. "You can all come in now." I walked into the barn with the other kids and stood staring pop-eyed. Tom was seated behind his desk wearing a green eye shade and an old printer apron that Papa must have given him. There was a printed sign tacked to a piece of 2x4 on the desk that read, "The Aidenville Bugle, T.D. Fitzgerald, editor and publisher." Laid out on his desk were 6 printed calling cards, which we all crowded around to read. "This is to certify blank is a reporter for the Aidenville Bugle." Then Tom leaned back in his nail-kegged chair and put his thumbs under his armpits. "How many of you would like to be a reporter for my newspaper?" he asked. We all raised our hands. "Do you know what a reporter does?" Tom asked. Sammy Lee nodded. "Sure," he said. "A reporter reports the news to his editor." "Right," Tom said. "A good reporter is one who keeps his eyes and ears open and reports the news whether it is good or bad. But how many of you know what is news and what isn't news?" It was a tough question because nobody answered. I will tell you, Tom said. If everybody in town knows something, then it isn't news. If only a very few people know something, then it is news to the rest of the people. Danny Forrester shrugged helplessly. How are we going to know if only a few people or a lot of people know something? He asked. Easy, Tom said. If you overhear somebody say to somebody, don't breathe a word of this to anyone, that is news. If you hear somebody say, I wouldn't want this to go any further, that is news. There are a lot of things in this town only a few people know about. It will be your job as reporters to find out what these are. But, Sammy protested, and without his sly look on his city slicker face, my pa and ma never talk about things like that until after I go to bed. Then stay awake and sneak down the stairways and listen, Tom said. The only local news my father prints is what people tell him when they want him to print it. For example, what was the local news in the Advocate delivered this morning? Mrs. Hanson left Friday to visit her sister in Provo. Mrs. Leonard entertained the ladies' sewing circle at her home last Thursday. Mr. Phillips was made a deacon in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Mrs. Sheldon gave birth to a baby boy last Wednesday night. This isn't real news for my money. By the time the Advocate comes out on Tuesday, everybody knows it. I don't want this kind of news for the Bugle. I want the kind of news that will reveal the deep secrets in this town that the public is entitled to know. Now line up, men, and I'll give you your press cards and assignments. Basil, your assignment will be the Palace Cafe your father owns. Strangers in town eat there, and what they say may be news to people who live here. Seth, your mother is the biggest gossip in town. It'll be your job to report the gossip. Jimmy, your mother runs a boarding house, so you listen to what everybody says and report anything that is news. Danny, your father owns the barber shop, and barbers hear a lot of things other people don't know. Your assignment is to find out what these things are. Sammy, your father gets into more arguments than any man in town. It will be your job to report about any of these arguments everybody doesn't know about. JD, you will cover the marshal's office and report who was arrested and why. Then Tom stood up and placed his hands on his desk. We've got a newspaper to get out by Saturday, men, he said dramatically. You will all report here Friday afternoon, right after lunch, to return in your news stories. I watched the other reporters swagger out of our barn and then looked at Tom. I don't think Papa intended for you to get a real newspaper in competition with his newspaper, I said. He isn't going to like it. I know, JD, Tom said. It is the only way I can convince Papa that I'm old enough to help him at the Advocate.